Good morning. This is Joe Anderson with CEC, the Consortium for Educational Change. This is the second day of our virtual labor management collaboration virtual symposium on working together, labor management and other stakeholders to reopen our schools safely. Before I introduce our keynote speaker this morning, David Edwards, and then have a conversation with him, I want to introduce my two colleagues, Crystal Conley, who will be overseeing the chat room and questions and answers, and in a moment she'll give some guidance and direction on how to use those. And of course, Steve Yulzak, who's our tech person, who's also with us in the background, making sure everything works smoothly. So, Crystal.
Good morning, everyone. We will have two ways of communicating today. There's a chat function at the bottom if you would like to contribute to the general conversation. And there's also a Q&A option if you would like to send Joe or David a direct question that you would like for them to answer. So again, Q&A function is for direct questions that you would like answered. Chat function is more of a general contribution to the conversation. Also, if you do put a question into the Q&A for David or Joe, please reference their name in the question so that we know who to direct the question to. Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal. Hopefully most of the questions will be for David. So it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and friend over in the last 10 plus years, David Edwards. David is with us from Brussels. Good afternoon, David. It's 10:30 in the morning here in Chicago. What time is it in Brussels?
It's 5:30 p.m. here, Joe.
Okay, welcome. And David is General Secretary of Education International, and he'll talk a little bit more about what Education International is. It's overall an organization of teacher unions and associations throughout the world, but I'll let him describe that in more detail. David is in background American. I think he grew up in Pennsylvania, has his doctorate from the University of Maryland, has worked in a variety of international settings. He taught high school here, though, in this country before going on to the Organization of American States, and then for a time working for the National Education Association on its international portfolio, and then just about 10 years ago, joined Education International. I think David has a lot to offer us today in terms of a transnational, international perspective on the crisis of the global pandemic and how it's impacting education and education stakeholders, students, parents, teachers, staff, communities, administrators around the world. So David, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Why don't you first tell us, if you would, a little bit about EI and your role with EI and what that entails as General Secretary.
Sure. It's a question my parents ask me sometimes too, Joe. So it's one that I'm getting better at explaining. Yeah, I'm the General Secretary, which is an elected position of Education International, which is the global union federation of teachers' organizations, unions, and associations. We have about 400 organizations, starting from early childhood all the way up to higher ed, in about 178 countries. That means we represent approximately about 32 million educators. That's also education support personnel as well. And we have offices in regions. We're in 5. Well, we also have a cross region in the Middle East. We represent the teaching profession with the United Nations, with the World Bank, the IMF, so a lot of work there. We also work in terms of development and helping teachers' organization, be more responsive on what you do in terms of helping their members and improving teaching profession. We have a lot of policy work we do. We have a lot of policy dialogue that we do. We do a lot of advocacy work. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals was a key campaign of ours to make quality education one of the sustainable standalone goals that we achieved back in 2015. And yeah, basically we're in almost all countries, I would say right now, with the exception of China. We have constitution and bylaws. You have to be an independent organization to join EI. That means you have to have elected leaders. You have to have a constitution, has to be independent. And, that's not the case there, where the leadership is appointed. But it's very important, this independence. And one thing I would also just add, Joe, is we've been around in a different form for a lot longer. Prior to being EI, there were three global federations that go back actually the late 1800s. One was the World Council on the Teaching Profession. One was the International Federation of Free Teachers Unions. And one was the World Council on Teaching, which were the private schools. And all three of those came together in 1993 to form Education International. So the three came together to form one singular global. And we're the largest single profession federation in the world.
Thank you, David. In terms of your role, you do, as you were suggesting, a lot of representing of teachers and educators to the United Nations and other key entities in the global space. You were mentioning just before we went on live on this broadcast, your involvement with the World Health Organization currently. Speak a moment about that and
Sure.
your responsibilities there.
Yeah, so I'm on the World Health Organization, which together with UNICEF and UNESCO has a technical advisory group on reopening schools globally. So we are putting out guidance and guidelines for ministries of education and governments, civil society organizations, teachers organizations, labor management groups about what we know and what the trade-offs are. And we're having a lot of discussions right now about what we also don't know. When the conversation I asked recently, because we're doing a lot of tracking around transmission with children and in schools and what we know around that and sort of the different hotspots and the vectors. And I asked about teachers, and they weren't actually collecting any of the data on teachers and the effect on teachers. And one of the things I was telling Joe was it was sort of striking to me that obviously we're worried about children, and I think we can have a long conversation about why we all want to open schools up in a safe, secure way and all the benefits of school. But it was kind of interesting that no one was actually asking the question about the adults that work in schools, not just the teachers, but the support staff and others. And I found that to be quite interesting, that was sort of an afterthought, because there was a really important Lancet study that was talking about the transmission, from school closures, what the reduction is for COVID. And they were saying, yeah, you only really reduce it by about, somewhere between 9 and 13%. And I asked the question, but if those are adults, is anyone looking into them? Like, oh, that's really, really good. We hadn't really thought about that. So it's quite interesting. There's a lot of work being done. There's a million different networks and task forces, both working towards the vaccine, but also working on tracking and tracing, looking and sort of testing out the guidelines and what they think they know, and testing different hypotheses. There's general consensus around a few things, but then we come back together every couple of weeks and there's a new study, and we have to kind of think about it, what that means in terms of how we're going to advise based on that. Sometimes it's about an age level, something you're not seeing really anything in under 10, but you maybe 11, but from 12 and up, you're starting to see some transmission. And the question some ministers have, so is it okay for primary schools, but not for middle schools and secondary schools? And, the answer is it depends, because, if you're in a country that has a very high R and you're a country that has a very low R or flat, those are very different discussions, So
R, define R, low R.
That's the reproduction rate. So like if one person to one person transmission, if you give it to someone else. So if it's above 1, that means you're increasing the number of exponentially in terms of the transmission.
Thanks. From your perspective and unique vantage point, how do you see this pandemic, once in a century cataclysmic event, how do you see it impacting the world in the various parts of the world? What's your overview, if you will? I know you could probably take a week to tell us that, but in some kind of telescope way, can you give us an overview of how's this hitting other parts of the world in it, as well as the United States.
Yeah, sure. And the issue of whether it's a once in a in a century pandemic, I had the chief epidemiologist of the WHO speak to the executive board of EI, and she started her presentation with this ominous we don't even know if it's of the decade, which was we don't even know if the next one's already out there, which was quite scary. But let's just park that for now and operate where we are and with what we know. So what's happening? So basically it's about 1.1 billion students that are out of school right now. 300 million of them now not getting any kind of school feeding program at all. You should also keep in mind, I think it's really hard. Half the world's population doesn't have access to the internet. So a lot of the sort of underlying assumptions of what can be done around distance and virtual education is actually not very relevant in a lot of places in terms of synchronous and asynchronous instruction. So they go to radio or you go to television and things like that. And then half, I would say, of those in terms of that don't have access to the internet, there's still a large proportion of human beings that are living without access to electricity itself. So that's just sort of helpful to keep in mind about, not everyone is sort of sheltering in place on a laptop. I know that everyone here understands that. It's hit, if we were to say, it sort of hit China first and then Europe, and then out from Europe. There were, let's say that in Europe, when it sort of peaked in about somewhere, the first peak was the middle of March, the second one sort of middle of April. There was a couple of different responses to it. There was a whole group that was not going to close schools, not a whole group, there was Boris Johnson, and was not going to close schools at all and go for herd immunity. But the doctors' associations, the medical associations, and his own advisors advised against that. But they lost a couple important weeks there, which then led to the spikes that they're seeing. And part of the reason why they're not allowed back beyond Brexit back into Europe is that. The Nordics and the Scandinavians took a different track. The Swedes decided they were going to keep elementary schools open and close secondary schools. They were going to have people telework. So they did have this thing, but they were sort of on the far end of sort of keeping things open. Again, they had they have a very high incidence rate, transmission and deaths for Europe, but that was theirs. An interesting one, the Danes decided that they were going to try to keep sort of the early grades somewhat open and worked with the unions on an agreement where that could happen. Protecting the older teachers as well was a big issue for the Scandinavians, and they have what's called an institutionalized dialogue collective agreement where they were privy to information and talking to the governments every step of the way as they were talking about social distancing, figuring out how middle schools could take the overflow from elementary schools and things like that. And so there's this, and the Norwegians kind of followed suit with that, the Finns. Iceland didn't see a huge spike, but they kind of followed that, kind of careful, but everyone basically following the rules. So you didn't have to worry about compliance too much because basically people were following the rules and it was good. Southern Europe got hit really hard, the Mediterranean. Italy was the first big hotspot, particularly around the Lombardy area. The hospitals were flooded. Again, not very much public hospitals there. That was the sort of the center of privatized healthcare in Italy, which had something to do with that. Spain followed in terms of quite a big outbreak. The Germans were well prepared. They had a lot of PPE, they had a lot of preparation, they had a lot of hospital beds, and they were able to sort of track and trace. I think they're best known for the track and tracing. Then it spread, and the story in the US, and we can talk about the US a little bit as well. Then it spread sort of to Latin America and Africa. The first hotspots in Latin America was Ecuador, Peru, the Andean region. Argentina, and now the worst places is Brazil. It's getting hit really, really hard. It's about 50,000 deaths, so they're really climbing quickly. And I think one of the things there is that they're not really testing. So the only way to really know what the numbers are is to compare to the mortality rates at this time over a 3-month period of last year. So you could see like Ecuador was 10 times as high. And so you started to see that. I think in sub-Saharan Africa, in particular, we were very concerned because of Ebola. There were some countries in Western Africa that were somewhat prepared in terms of already having some sort of screening and hygienic procedures in place. But I think the thing to keep in mind is that we've been spending the last 20, 30 years trying to get girls into school, to get child laborers into school, trying to do wraparound services, nutrition programs, vaccination programs. So when the schools closed there, what did that mean? And with the sort of the confluence of crises, the economic crisis, the health crisis, and the political crises, you have families trying to decide, okay, so dad's lost the job or mom's lost the job, everything's closed, we're on lockdown. Now your education is not the most important thing. The most important thing is, earning money for the family. So you got to go out in the street and beg, or you have to go in the fields and work. In many places, girls we've seen a high incidence of child marriage return. There's been big campaigns fighting against child marriage, and so we're seeing a spike there. And when teachers, we surveyed our members, I should have said that too. We've done a number of surveys with our members around the world. There's a high percentage of them that say they have no idea what happened or what is happening to their most vulnerable students, which is really scary. So, the Ghanaian teachers, for example, were trying to see if they could sort of trace and track some of the more vulnerable students with the ministry. And I know other countries in Africa were doing that as well. But you also just didn't have a national plan in place. So it's not like everyone takes their laptop and then connects to Blue Jeans and automatically all their students connect. A lot of them had to go and visit or make phone calls and try to check. So, and as in all good crises, you get a lot of people that look at an opportunity for business to make money and profit off it. And so there were a lot of disruptors that thought they could, and still think they can, sort of sell their wares at a very cheaper cost than hiring teachers. But that's not proven to be true, I think, for the most part, in terms of the sort of spectacular failure of a lot of these. Both in terms of everywhere we've talked about, the teachers have told us that there has been an unprecedented increase in appreciation for what teaching is and what the importance of schools and communities. I think you've heard that in the States, I'm sure as well. And then that comes at the same time as this sort of economic crisis where they're trying to figure out, can they even afford to have teachers in a socially distanced, or can they even have the investments in infrastructure that all the guidelines are going to require? I mean, Australia, you probably know, and New Zealand, they really beat it back. I mean, they're complaining about 8 cases in Victoria. And, I was trying to put that with the president of the Australian Education Union, our president of EI, actually, her name's Susan Hopgood, put that in perspective for her, that's a village here in Belgium. We had 8 yesterday in the village next door to mine. So, they're going to close off, and their schools are going to reopen shortly. Now, what I would say is that not all countries approached both the closure nor the reopening in the same way. I began with the sort of Nordic dialogue, but there were countries that found out about the reopenings in the newspaper. There were teachers in some places that actually, Burkina Faso, the teachers actually didn't get paid for the 3 months. So we saw some, variability around, conditions of service. But I think the countries that are they're still right in the heat of it are thinking about whether or not they're going to be able to reopen after those in the northern hemisphere go into their summer break, and those in the southern hemisphere go into their winter break. So it's quite unprecedented. University sector, I would say, is also, the private university sector has been hit really hard. Those that depend on international students' fees. So obviously with the quarantines and the travel bans, Australia, I mean the US, and others are seeing a 30% drop coming from that. And I would say the other thing that we've really noticed quite strongly is that private education, it was the quickest and hardest hit. That's where you saw the quickest layoffs. Those where you see the schools closed without any, by and large, any kind of distance. Now, sure, in the upper income private schools, they had something in place, but and also early childhood centers that were not publicly funded. Also, even in some of the Nordic places, countries suffered. So, yeah, it's not been an easy time, Joe. But that gives you a little taste of kind of what's been going on.
Yeah, you're mentioning about early childhood centers, the private ones in particular, and a lot of our early childhood in this country is in the private sector, not in public schools. One of our colleagues that is most versed in early childhood is essentially saying, hey, the early childhood sector in some places is just going to disappear. But what I hear you saying, David, is something similar about large parts of the world. The education system may disappear, especially for girls and young women, et cetera. I mean, it's that drastic, I hear you saying.
Yeah, just for a point of comparison, there are countries that are heavily indebted right now, that aren't having any income coming in. And so they're looking at their sort of social spend as not investment, but as a pure cost. And, I don't have to tell you, but the 85% recurrent expenditure in teacher salaries, the infrastructure issues, all the things that they're going to have to do. There are countries that are trying to figure out whether to pay the interest on their debt or pay for their education system. And that's where some of these that I mentioned before, some of these sort of private operators are coming in and saying, we can offer you don't need to highly qualify a teacher. You can just get somebody with a heartbeat off the street. We'll give them an iPad, have it controlled from Boston, or someone that tells them what to do in terms of teaching. And we basically turn teaching into content delivery with an assessment system on the other side that can massively reduce your costs. And maybe you don't even need a place called school. Maybe you can figure out a way of doing that, online and things like that. And somehow that's modern and progress. So there are countries that are really struggling that we're working with, where our members are, who are really struggling with what and if schools can open, and how are they going to even have the fiscal space to be able to make those sort of basic health systems.
Yeah.
Think about the health systems too, right?
Yeah. Well, given this landscape, how have you seen teacher unions, teacher organizations, and their ministries or governments interacting, or at the district level? We have, as you know, in this country, 14,000 school districts. That's not always the case in other parts of the world, that they even have such things as districts. Our audience here in the symposium are teams from districts across the country, from Maine to Alaska, California, Illinois, and across the country. Help us understand how some of your member organizations, teacher unions and associations in the various parts of the world have been coping, and some of the things that have been effective, and some of the strategies that have been effective. I'd love for you to talk about as well your EI, Education International, approach and advice around your 5 pillars. But tell us about how you see the role of the union and collaboration with management and communities unfolding in different parts of the world.
Yeah, I'm thanks. It's an important question, and it's, you know, it's not exactly always the way we wish it would be. I mentioned already some countries find out about what's happening in the newspaper, whether they're going back the next day or not. But you know, we don't stop being teachers just because schools close, and I think that's something that teachers organization, teachers unions, and EI feel very strongly. And many of our own members came up with their own tests. They researched, they worked with, you know, with health experts and others, and they started looking and gathering and sharing with each other. So we built these platforms for sharing of experiences and good practices and talking about what works where. A lot of focus was on Denmark early because of the sort of MOU structures that they were around flexibility in terms of leave and use of leave and vacation and later hours, because they needed to be able to both, you know, there was a whole thing on double shifts. There was this whole sort of, you know, they were trying to cover the curriculum and then have follow up in the later in the day with parents and, you know, kids, and they were doing sort of double work, and it wasn't getting counted as double work. And so we were seeing a lot of stress and burnout and need for counseling. So some of our members were actually growing because their teachers were coming to them asking for advice and support. You know, what do I say? I want to be helpful, but you know, I also have to educate my kids who are here at home with me, you know, so I can't do a 13-hour day and then also be supporting my own kids. So we started to take some of these sort of framework agreements and kind of exchanging approaches there. There were countries where the idea of bringing back retired teachers to kind of help in order to, that was early something until we started to see the spike around the 60-year age. Should say in Portugal, I think it's 2/3 of the teachers in Portugal are at least above 55. I got to check the exact stat there, but we have a very advanced age population in some parts of the world. We started thinking about what we were learning from what the different members were doing. So we held all these webinars like you're doing, and started looking at what our colleagues in UNESCO and World Health Organization and other places, the OECD we worked very closely with, and saying, well, what kinds of things are important? Because we weren't going to get granular and tell people what they should do, because that's very context specific. Like you've got the, you know, the 14,000 districts in a very decentralized, devolved system in the US, but you have others that are they're not federations. They're much more centralized in terms of equity, you know, funding and things like that. So we were able to draw out sort of beyond what we did with the World Health Organization, which is the sort of 6 conditions from the WHO on opening schools. We said that the first pillar was engage in social and policy dialogue. And that was to build the trust in terms of sharing information and having sort of a common understanding of what we're going to be. Obviously, these aren't going to be light switches that are flipped, as you've heard many times. It's going to be sort of turned on and turned down, and certain things are going to have to be relaxed, and to keep an open dialogue with the teachers unions, the teachers organizations, parents, and others, because these are also the people that are going to be talking to the parents. These are also the people that are going to be talking to the press. These are the people who are going to in the communities themselves and have a great deal of you know, support right now. And so it's really important. And the countries that had sort of institutionalized dialogue processes like this, but maybe more formalized, actually legal requirements, they actually were able to come to agreements before the school openings were announced. And we thought that was something that OECD agreed with us, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, excuse me.
Thank you.
you know, the PISA test people, Andreas Schleicher, and others thought that was really, really important. In fact, the UNESCO Task Force on Teachers adopted our pillars and developed them a little bit further. We thought the other one that's important is ensuring the health and safety of education communities. So I think that goes without saying that that's a pillar of any sort of comprehensive plan that needs to be part of making sure that that health and safety is foremost. You heard me talk about the equity problems, the inequities, and we said that we really need to make equity a top priority. Joe and I've talked about this before. It's not a new problem, and I think to you on either side of, you're on the same team in terms of trying to ensure the right to education to every child and student, and to see the struggles of kids that can have tutors and those who can't, the kids that have the after school, that have the parents that are able to work with them, and then you have the kids whose parents lost jobs and are hungry. You have kids in situations of violence and abuse. You have kids who don't have a laptop. They are sharing their parents' phone, and you have districts and you have school, jurisdictions that have provided and those that haven't provided. I can go on and on and on about all the different inequities. Teachers who were prepared to use the distance education platforms and were trained and had vetted them, and and worried about the privacy issues that we saw in many countries about data. And so we're actually auditing the sort of equity, the educational inequities that we saw as a result of the pandemic. The pandemic kind of pulled the curtain back and exacerbated. In many countries, it's scandalous. The level. Support physical and emotional well-being recovery. A really interesting study by the Alberta teachers to your north that are looking at the sort of empathy-related stress and trauma. These are, they were also talking about, it's also the Canadians that were talking about having to drive for Wi-Fi, teachers that had to like spend their whole day in a car because they didn't have Wi-Fi at home. And we heard about rural teachers and things like that. But the need for counseling services, this is a traumatic time. You know it. You've seen what's happening with your own kids, and teachers want to help, and they're worried, and they're burning themselves out. Like I said, the double shifting, and we just need to make sure that there's a recovery plan in place. So when people come out of this, that they have the psychological services. In the UK, there's a thing called teacher support, which does surveys around well-being, and they're really quite good. Been around for about 100 years, and there's groups like that we're working with on that front. And I think the last pillar, and all of these have further descriptions on our website, and I gave Joe some information, and I can happily share.
All of that information, David, will be in the resource guide for the symposium. So people.
Compassion fatigue. Thank you. Someone just put that up there. Compassion fatigue. That's the Albertan. And the last one is trust the professionalism of educators. I think, you're all in a country with sort of high stakes accountability, sort of test-based accountability. And, that didn't quite work in this moment. You had to trust teachers. Formative assessment became, accepted, and teachers had to figure out what platform they were going to use, what methodology, whether they were going to try to meet some standard, some random standard when a kid is, dealing with a parent without a job and not sleeping and feeling stressed and missing their friends, and all these things and all the emotion that comes with that. And this was a moment where I think putting the, we always talk about Finland as sort of high trust, high quality, basically because they put all the effort in, both in terms, not just, everyone likes to talk about the selection, and the pay and whatever, but it's also in the trust in the profession. And that is something that good systems, equitable systems, inclusive, high quality systems double down and trust their educators to make the right choices, and they figure out ways of supporting them in terms of instructional needs and getting feedback from them about how things are doing, and they don't sort of impose, we always say assessment can either be done for improvement or control. And I think in times of pandemics, we can really see those systems that are only about control and selection and those that are about information and improvement and support. It's a conversation. And I think that was another big thing. The last thing I would say is just in terms of what unions are doing is we had a virtual ISDP, the International Summit on the Teaching Profession. And we have a lot of these policy dialogue forums that are happening. This one was specifically sharing labor management approaches to the pandemic. So we had 20 countries that were around the table, well, virtually around the table, discussing just these we build around these 5 pillars. And we had a conversation about the quality of the dialogue, the quality of the trust, the sort of tech, what we were learning around the tech and the IT and things like that. And at the sub sort of national level, there's also what's called the ARC initiative, which is the Atlantic Rim Collaboratory, which Andy Hargrave runs out of Ottawa. And I think was part of Turn, he and Dennis Shirley. I don't know if they're connected here at all, but that's also a very interesting one because that is sort of like subnational jurisdictions collaborating, so states to state, and sometimes could even be city to city. And so we participate with them with the labor management work there. And we're in sub-Saharan Africa, we're also building one with the AU and the teachers unions in Africa to kind of figure out what school reopening looks like. So it's a lot, and be happy to talk more about any of those initiatives too.
Well, let me go back a bit to the way Denmark seems to have handled through their MOUs some of the incredible stress and burnout that they were experiencing with their teachers. Talk a little bit more about you talked about frameworks that emerged there. Those might be very interesting and useful to our colleagues in this country around how they might think, because everybody's trying to move into these changing the new normal, as it's called, trying to figure out how to restructure agreements, relationships, expectations, whatever. Give us a little more around what we could learn from Denmark or other countries around some of the frameworks and MOUs they developed and how they went about it.
Yeah, I mean, they have collective agreements through social dialogue legislation that requires them to get sign-off on any changes that affect the contract, that in terms of conditions of service, right? So if you took Denmark, one of the things had to do, my headphone's losing its battery a little bit, so I'm just cognizant of that, had to do with the fact that, what do we do with the sick days? What do we do with overtime? Because there's going to be a lot of overtime. So they had an MOU around the use of overtime and how that was going to be calculated and how that was going to be worked out. There was a lot of stuff around planning time. There was a lot of stuff around teacher evaluations. So they did separate sort of MOUs where some of this was just sort of push pause on, not exactly evaluations because they're not quite evaluations. They're more appraisals and assessment systems than things like that. And then there was the whole issue around bringing in additional people into the schools to sort of help. And, in terms of what would have been seen as sort of a 0 hours contract, bringing additional people in to help. There were some agreements that were reached around the non-teachers, but the sort of support staff that were brought in to help.
What was the time boundness of this? Were they time bounded, or how do they deal with the changing landscape and flexibility around what they might have worked out today that maybe in a month might not be still applicable? How did they grapple with that?
Yeah, I mean, we could get them to I could get Dorte to talk to you about the specifics on that. And then she wrote something for me that I'm happy to share with you about how they approached some of those different things. I mean, one of the things that was really tricky had to do with reporting for duty and at what point, who gets to decide whether someone is in a high risk population or not? So is it if your doctor does it, do you have to go to the national health system to get, because of your age, because it's so they kind of, they worked out some language around that. And at the end, it was a bit of a fight, but at the end, it was your doctor. You could have a notification from your doctor, and that would excuse you. But yeah, I think it's better if I actually, because it's different from Denmark to Norway to, you know,
Well,
the Germans vary by state, federal states too.
well, in some ways, finding temporary ways to resolve these issues and very context specific. I mean, there's not lessons in one place that are going to be applicable in another. It's more the processes or the ways they go about them. And I think what you said, and Andreas Schleicher from OECD kind of confirmed this, that where there was institutionalized labor management collaboration, if I could put it that way, they have been able to navigate and weather this crisis the most effectively. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely, yeah. Those countries that had institutionalized dialogue were the ones where they didn't actually have to kind of go back and redo everything over again. So I'll give you the example that's sort of, you can take, is like the UK. You know, I'm not, you can read about it in the Guard, you can read about it in the Daily Mail or something like that. There were announcements, the French actually too, you had announcements from heads of state saying schools will open on, you know, June 2nd or June 1st or whatever it was. And they were all going, well, that's news to us. How would we have heard that? And, you know, in the Scandinavian countries, you know, they had already had a plan. They'd already sort of worked out an agreement about, if the numbers go up to a certain point, we pull back. You know, here's where it's about social distancing, and we're going to do sanitation. We're going to bring in, you know, cleaners to clean the school. We're going to work on all these kinds of things. And here's, you know, a purely political decision where actually the management, the Secretary of Education in DFE in the UK had to say, actually, we didn't even know that was going to be announced. That was news to us, you know. So we've looked at those. But then you could also go all the way to Singapore, right, where everything they do is basically they clear it. You know, it's also because of the multi-track system that they have around education. But Korea even had a dialogue, so they already figured out that the teachers were going to wear masks, but the students weren't going to wear masks, that they were going to do the temperature checks. Although if you talk to my friends at the WHO, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense because you're actually contagious before you get a fever. So, but it made the people feel better. So, you know, and then you had the UK, and then they had to pull it back, right? So they were going to open, and then they weren't going to open. They were going to open, and then they said, we'll just wait. We'll do what Wales in Scotland said, which is wait till the end of the summer in the Northern Hemisphere. And that was sort of just a massive disaster because kids thought they were going back and they weren't, and schools were getting ready and then they weren't. And, you know, the teachers had this thing called the 5 tests, which had to about increasing the amount of testing. It had to do about having a plan in terms of what happens if there's a whole district closed, there's a school closed. You know, they couldn't answer these basic questions. And, you know, if you went to Denmark or Norway or Finland or someplace else, they would say, oh yeah, well, that's already agreed. You know, if we won't actually close a school if it's one kid, but if it's a certain number of a whole classroom gets it, you know, we'll take a look. And, you know, they had sort of if-then scenarios, kind of conditionalities worked out. And that is a product of a long history of dialogue and trust building. And it doesn't mean that you always agree. Right. I think it's really important that you make we're not going to agree on everything, but, you know, we kind of understand what we're for, and we know what we want to have agreement around what success would look like in terms of what's best for kids, and having those pillars and having that safe place. So that the dialogue is absolutely fundamental for that. I think Andreas and I did a blog. Andreas Schleicher and I from OECD, we did an Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, did a blog on that. And I think they endorsed our pillars. The UNESCO also endorsed our pillars. And I think, I don't know of a single organization or think tank that thinks going it alone is a winning strategy. well, maybe I can think of one, but that's from my own country.
Okay. Um, well, that really helps understand the first pillar of social and policy dialogue. And the social dialogue is really this institutionalized collaboration between the stakeholders, including the unions and management and others. So maybe we're getting near the end of our time, but we got about 15 minutes. Let me go back to the last pillar, which is trusting the profession. What is it in your view that the profession, organized teachers, their unions, other school staff and their unions have to do to be up for and earn that trust? What's it's kind of a two-way street there, isn't it? And how would you explore that a little bit with us?
Well, I think let me take the internationalist kind of thing first, okay?
Sure.
We at our last World Congress in July adopted a global framework for the establishment of professional teaching standards globally with UNESCO, right? Sort of principles for doing that. And our member organizations passed that. There were questions around certain things and responsibilities, which is fine. But in essence, you know, the teaching profession in the countries in which we operate, which is 178, take that responsibility very seriously. They take the entry criteria, they take the professional development, they take their custodial responsibilities, their social responsibilities, being parts of communities. They take all of that very seriously. And I think that you know, there was a time of sort of when trust, well, let's say, we remember the U.S. is not exactly the best example for all other countries in terms of talking about, you know, trust all the time, because we fall into these rabbit holes. But I think that teachers that take responsibility for their profession, for the development, for the research that informs their profession, that come to the table prepared to speak on what's best for, you know, not just the profession, but for students and communities, that are open to hearing new research and new ideas and new ways of working. All of that is part of the responsibilities, which is the other part of our rights. So in 1966, UNESCO, there was a Delors at the time of, I think it was time of Jacques Delors, created the 1960 recommendations on the teaching profession. And those are really still kind of at the core of who we are. That's sort of like our Hippocratic oath in a way. And they form the basis of a lot of sort of both the rights and the responsibilities of the teaching profession. And I think, you know, I've seen stories right now and I've been, I guess because of where I am, people send me videos and they send me stories, and I'm sure you've seen these too, but of the teachers that are, you know, the librarians that are delivering books, right? The teachers that are teaching through the glass door, the Nepalese rural teacher who rides on his bicycle all day long to teach, you know, kids in really, really distant, far away, and on and on and on and on and on. I think the teaching profession has, in this particular moment, increased drastically, but I don't think we ever suffered massively. I think there was a sort of a narrative that was out there that you needed to basically create a system, a teacher-proof system. Yeah, and so instead of like collaborative professionalism, it was about assume that you can't trust them, and try to build a system that gets about as good as you can there. And we got stuck in some places there. And then as a result of that, you know, the positions on either side were, all right, I'll just start marshaling arguments based on evidence that serves me in my defensive stance and you in your whatever stance. And it stopped the ability for new information and new synthesizing learning and understanding and approaches. And I think globally, right now, really good education systems are talking to each other and learning from each other. They're not insular. They're not thinking they have it all worked out. And I think there's a lot to learn out there. I mean, I was really sad to see the U.S. pull out of UNESCO. I'm really sad to see the U.S. pull out of the WHO. I'm really sad to see, the U.S. Decrease all of its funding to the Organization of OECD, Economic Cooperation and Development. I think it's a bad moment for the United States to pull out of the global community in the time of a global pandemic. And because I just think there's just so much that could benefit and kind of help trying to tackle these questions. And go back to Andreas and I, we say at the beginning of every summit is that everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. So this is what research that we've agreed on says. Now we can question the assumptions that are built into the models, the regressions, the alpha. We can go on to all of that stuff, and we can have good heated debates about all of these different things. But we don't run away from research, and we don't run away from information, because that's our core business. That's who we are, and that's what we're about.
Let me follow up on that. And Crystal, I don't see any questions. Do you have any questions? Otherwise, I'm going to just continue. I have a couple more questions myself. But Crystal, do we have any questions?
We do not.
Okay. That just gives me more time, David. You were talking about the International Summit of the Teaching Profession. I was a senior advisor to Arne Duncan back in 2010 when we had the first one of those. And the U.S. was really the architect and organizer of that. We had the first two summits in New York City. And so it's really exciting to hear that they're still going on. You just had your 10th, albeit virtual. Mm-hmm. Was the United States there? And if not, why not?
The United States was not there, has turned down, since the Trump administration has turned down the opportunity to participate, because the summit it's a special, I should say something about the agreement that we forged there was, the only way you can have a full delegation is if the minister or the secretary agrees to sit down at the table, behind the flag with the teacher union leaders. So if they refuse, then if they don't want to, so if Betsy DeVos doesn't want to sit with Randy and Lily, then, which she, then they don't come, because that was what the original agreement was that we forged way back in the time with Arne and the folks at the department, and also at the NEA and AFT and EI, and that's, it's sort of a core thing. But you would be happy to know that the Canadians took it and they did province-wide summits. The Swedes do statewide summits leading up to the ISB, where they actually, because the other thing is you have to make a commitment together. You have to learn and listen. And at the very end of the summit, based on the experts and the research and the debate, you say, these are the 3 areas that we're going to work on together, and we commit. And the union and the minister has to present that together. And at the beginning of the next summit, they have to present a report on how they've advanced towards that goal. So that also kind of forces a certain level of dialogue.
So in this country, albeit we can't have a national summit or even participate as a nation in the international summit, some states could have statewide summits. And in fact, the last few years, like California and New Jersey, have had partnership agreements at the state level between the major stakeholders. It was led out in California by the California Department of Education. So that's happening in other parts of the world.
Oh, good. Yeah. No, I think that's one of the great stories of the ISTP. Now, I know principals organizations have been trying to create a principals ISTP. I mentioned the ARC project, which we actually participated in, which is the subnational sort of ISTP. It's actually longer. You really study the system. So you spend a couple days and you really got to go on a study tour. And but yeah, I think there's been a major contribution, and I can't overstate the significance of sitting behind your national flag, right? Because you're representing your country. So at the pledge, you have to say, we, the United States, on behalf of our students, teachers pledge to do this together, you
Right.
know, and that really says a lot. You know, if labor and management isn't willing to say something together on behalf of the entire system, on behalf of the citizens, and on behalf of the human beings that they were, it really is a indicator of, I think, a deeper problem that's well, yeah. I think I should leave it there.
Well, let me just throw you another hot potato here at the end. Well, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise and wisdom with us. It's been a pleasure. As a United States citizen now working in the international community, if you had just one or two points of advice for, and forget the national for the moment, that'll have to play itself out. But for people at the state and district and school levels, if you had one or two points of advice for your countrymen and women, what would it be to your fellow countrymen and women?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have a couple, but I think I started talking about one before, which is don't allow the insular and don't allow the everything's better here narrative to take root. I really think there's a lot of important information and techniques and methodologies and insights to be gained from engaging with the world. And I think there's a lot of ways you can do that through international networks and associations. And, I know you probably are part of lots of those, but there are also the international institutions that are part of that multilateral system. There's a lot to do. And so I would say a lot of the intractable problems could benefit from some light that comes from stepping out and thinking about it from a different way. And I really find that, I'm not the sort of, esoteric cosmopolitan hippie when I say that. I have seen it firsthand, reflecting back on your stuff. And I think the second one has to do somewhere between positive intentionality and staying in it. This is a really tough moment. This is it's amplifying a lot of things. It's bringing out the best of people in many ways, but it's also bringing out a lot of fear, and decisions that are made out of fear try to contain what I have and otherize the other side. And I think if you can combine the positive intentionality, I mean, teachers and their organizations, yes, we have our members' interests at heart. We have our students and our community's interests at heart, but they're trying to do the right thing, just like I believe on the other side in terms of the management side, which is trying to figure out how do you invest the resources and the time in a way that can help develop the citizens and help develop communities and in a responsible way. So I mean, that border crossing, that boundary spanning, I think that's really important. I always talk about the time, tools, and trust. And my American organization presidents, one of them in particular, uses that a lot too. And I'd add truth to that. Time, tools, trust, and truth. Keeping those as a sort of centerpiece of your dialogue. I think that's what I'd like to offer in terms of what I've learned looking at the ways in which other systems run and relationships work for the benefit of the education system and students. So, but I'm pulling for you. I'm far away, but I feel very, very American. I'm reminded I'm the only American in EI, so I'm always reminded of how American I am.
Thank you, David. Hey, there was one question. I think it was, Chris, if I'm right, was there a question about the National Union Presidency of the United States, Lily and Randy? Did they offer or were they willing to participate in the international summit? And they were they there as listeners or?
They've come as part of the EI delegation. So we have this thing in Britain, it's called the waifs and strafes. So we have this special rider that if, you know, if the union leaders want to come as part of the EI delegation, they can come and potentially speak as part of the EI delegation. And on the OECD side, if there's a ministry, because we've had a minister or two where the union wasn't able, but they still wanted to come, and they came as part of the OECD delegation.
Well, thank you, David. I can't tell you how much we appreciate your insight and perspective, and Godspeed. And
thanks, Joe.
I hope to see you in person not too long from now. So
yeah, I'm not allowed in, and you're not allowed over here, but that'll be lifted soon. And
somewhere in the Atlantic, maybe.
Yeah, we'll go for the talk somewhere mid-Atlantic. That'd be great. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody. I think that sums it up.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.